Hey everyone, Jared here from CoderComplete. I recently got a request to go over responsive design. It's a very difficult topic. In fact, I think a lot of websites that are completely official still do not have good responsive design. So that's what I want to accomplish here today is present this idea of responsive design to you in all the different aspects of it in a very simple way, or as simple as I possibly can. And I think I'll make this a series where I go over the principles in this video, and then in the following video, I'll apply those principles to a real project where I will clone Airbnb's front end. So hopefully that sounds good to you. And I just want to share my screen and show you what I mean by some official websites, even them not having good responsive design. And in my opinion, I don't like Amazon's responsiveness because if I shrink, it looks fine full screen, obviously, but when I shrink it, I don't like that the search bar is cut off from all the stuff over here. I would have wanted them to, not have the UI scroll side to side like this. It's kind of weird, I think. So that just goes to show you responsiveness is sort of like an art in itself. There's a lot to consider with it. And so, yeah, I'm going to try to simplify it for you here today. So let's work on that. So when it comes to responsiveness, I've sort of broken it down into three main ideas here. And that is that all of the elements will be sized and positioned in a certain way. Number one, that the size of an element can be related to the screen size. So basically, the screen will change size and the element will change size in relation to the size of the screen. So that's one central idea of responsiveness. Another is that an element is sized or spaced relative to another element. So elements, we can create relationships between different elements that will hold true no matter how big or small the screen size is. And the last main idea with responsiveness is the idea of breakpoints, where in your UI, at a certain number of pixels of width of the screen size, the UI will change. You'll completely, or maybe completely or not, modify how things are styled. So I'll show you Airbnb as an example. Um, if you notice the pixels here, right here, once we get to about 743, so let me just do this really quick. So when we get to like 744 width, that's when the UI is going to completely change. Notice that everything's kind of the same, same, and all of a sudden, it looks completely different, and the breakpoint so happens to be at 744 pixels. So that's where Airbnb probably set a breakpoint to completely change certain styles within their UI. So that's the idea of breakpoints. So I want to demonstrate for you a lot of the different ways that you can size and space elements related to the screen and related to other elements in a really simple way first, so we get the concepts presented all within a reasonable amount of time. Of course, learning the concepts is as, you may understand it in a general sense, but still not fully visualize how to apply it to a real website. So that's what I plan on doing in the next video. So in this video, let's just try our best to summarize all this stuff, and I'll show you what I have so far as HTML and CSS. Pretty much very little. I just have a div with a class container and a div, three divs with class item inside the container. So the container is basically surrounding the items. And for styling, I don't have much. I just remove all the margin and padding on all of the elements that will be in our document initially, basically. Some elements have margin and padding by default, and I'm just removing those so I can set them all myself. And I've given the container and the items borders so that we can identify them as we modify them. So first things first, I just want to give an overview of the different ideas. I gave you the main ideas. Now let me show you some properties that we're going to consider and demonstrate. So we have units, meaning like when you specify the height and width of an element, you might use pixels, which is a specific size, but it's not relative to the screen size or relative to another element. When you size an element with pixels, it's always going to be the same size. So I'm going to show you, instead of using pixels, using percentages, using VH and VW, which stands for viewport width and viewport height, which basically is how we're going to relate an element's size to the size of the screen. Viewport is basically another word for screen size, essentially. I'm going to show you how we can basically allow the size of an element to scale up to a certain size and then stop scaling afterwards. I'll show you where that will be important. And the property I'll use for that is called max width. In fact, I'll just show you right now. Look at Airbnb's input. Um, it starts out really, see how it gradually increases as I increase the screen, but at a certain point, see, as I'm dragging the, increasing the screen size now, the input bar is not actually changing in size. So there is a maximum width that the input bar reaches, and then it doesn't scale anymore. I will show you flex. So flex is what we will use, also grid, both in different ways will allow you to position elements in and space elements, meaning like change the size of elements in relation to each other, instead of the screen, for example. I will show you media queries, which is basically how we set breakpoints. I'll show you, I may or may not need to do aspect ratio for images, but I'll mention it to make sure that images will be responsive as your screen size changes. And finally, I'll mention JavaScript and how it plays into this responsive idea. Okay, so let's start. Number one thing I wanted to do is show you the size of the container, ignoring the flex items for now. I might even comment them out. Oops. Commenting out the items for now. Just going to mess with the container first and show you kind of how sizing can differ based on how we define the size. So when I say define the size, I just mean height and width. So first let me do height, and you'll see, let's say I do 20 pixels. Let me do a little bit more. Okay, so our container is 100 pixels in height. However, notice that the width of our container is the full width of the screen. How did that happen? We never even specified the width of the container. So how did it know to stretch all the way to the edge of the screen? Because I could just say width 100 pixels, and now all of a sudden our container is just a box, right? Its width is actually only 100 pixels, but if I don't specify that, why does it default to the full width of the screen? Well, the reason for that is because of this property here, which is innate to divs. Every HTML element has some properties that it has by default. And by default, divs are display block. Let me show you what would happen if I change this div to display inline. Now it by default has 0 width, and only if I add stuff inside, let me add a little bit of text inside of the div, blah, 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 and let me go back again, say display inline. Now check it out. Our div, when I specify display inline, its size is just the size of the content inside of it, you see? So whatever I have in here, the width of this div will expand to fit, like the borders of the div will expand to fit all the content. So that's the idea of display inline. But display block, what it does is it basically says that this item, this element, is going to stretch as far as it possibly can. So because the only thing containing this div is the body, and the body is also the full width of the screen, this div, when it's display block, so I turned off display inline, so again, we're back to the default of display block, and now its width is the full screen width again. So hopefully that made sense. So I'd say more often than not, a element is by default display block. However, there are a lot of elements that are by default display inline, such as span, such as a, which is like a link, and other ones. But what's interesting with CSS is you can always change, or you can always override an element's default style. So any element that's by default inline, display inline, you can change to display block and vice versa. If anything's display block, you can change it to display inline. Or there are even other properties of display that we're going to go over soon. So anyway, this idea, ignoring display block and display inline now, basically you can specify a container's height and width, right? That's fine in pixels. And check it out, no matter how big or small the screen is, the div does not change size. What happens if instead I change its, let's say, width to 30%? Let's do like 50%. Now, check it out. The div is half of the current window, which is really just this big, very small. As I stretch the screen out, no matter what, the div changes size with the screen size. So this is responsive now. Basically, if our design called for this, where we want the div to always be half of the screen, then we have just achieved that idea. So that's using percentages. We could also use VW, but I will get into that when we get into the items. So I think that's all I wanted to say for the container size. I'm just going to mark that done. Now let's talk about item size. So let's add our items back in. And right now, why is there a solid black line stretching from the beginning of the green box to the end of the green box? Well, again, it's because these items are divs, which means that they will stretch by default widthwise as far as they possibly can. Because they're inside of a container, they only stretch the full width of the container. And why is it this thick? I bet if we were to look at this in a little bit closer, we'll see that each div is, well, actually each item div is 2 pixels in height. Why is that? Because right now the divs have no content inside, however, they do have a border. So the border is 1 pixel on the top, right, left, and bottom. Top, right, bottom, and left. And so what we're seeing as far as the height is 1 pixel on the top, 1 pixel on the bottom. So right now, if you look at the computed styles for each of the item divs, you'll see that, there's border on the top and bottom. So its height is actually 2, which is what you see in the pop-up here. 2, 2, 2. Now let's give each item some height. And now we see that they're stacked on top of each other, okay? Now, let's start specifying the width now. What if we wanted the width of each item, like right now each item stretches the full width and therefore they have to be on top of each other. What if we want them to be next to each other? Well, what if each item's width was 50 pixels? They're still on top of each other. Okay, so this is a interesting thing about display block. You would think once I change the width of each item to 50 that they'll immediately go next to each other. But actually, even so with display block, it still assumes that each div should be on its own line. So it's not going to put more than one item on the same line. Anything that's display block, nothing will be on the same line as it, no matter what, even if its width has been specified to be less. If I want these guys to be next to each other, I could give them display inline. So actually what we're seeing now is that display inline does not respect height and width for whatever reason. So we actually have to use something called inline-block. So if you want things to be inline and inline, display inline itself isn't working, use inline-block. Or default to always using inline-block. And you don't have to worry about too much the difference of each one. So this generally worked, although I'm noticing that there's like weird spacing that I never even set. None of my CSS says, oh, I want spacing in between each item or between the item and the container itself vertically. It turns out that that's a default behavior of inline block, and there are ways to fix that, but I'm not going to because I almost never use display block and inline. I'd probably change things sometimes to display inline just if I need a quick, easy solution. But I'm about to show you a better way, or a way that I use way more often to put things next to each other horizontally, basically. So don't need to worry about that too much right now. So that is width in pixels, right? So I've set each item's width in pixels. I've also showed you display inline, inline block, and display block. So now let me show you percentages instead. Our width is 50 pixels for each item. And check it out. Now our container is responsive, right? Because it's changing size related to the screen size. However, notice that each of the items is not changing size. And that's because we specified again that they are to be 50 pixels in width and that they're not going to change. So let's try percentages instead. Let's say 30%. So now they're about a third in width. And why are they so small? Why are they not 30% of the screen size? That's because percentage has to do with containers. The container for the div of class container is the body, but the container for these items is the div of class container. So the div of class container is sized at 50% of the screen we have available. Now each item is 30% of the size of the container. So as the container grows, so will the items. So that's percentage. What if instead I use VW? VW again stands for viewport width. And what that means is the width of the screen itself. So why did these jump onto their own lines now? Well, they can't fit two inside of this green container because they're both, two of these is bigger than the width of the container, so it wraps and goes down here. But notice that this black box is about a third of the width of the screen now. The screen being up until this point before our dev tools, right? So again, it's scaling with the size of the screen and it's relative to the size of the screen. So it has nothing, its size has nothing to do with this container anymore. That's what I did with VW. I don't use VW that often, but it is important to know about. Now I'm going to get into not only another way to size, but also position elements inside of each other. So the property is actually flex. You've probably been exposed to this before. So it's not here that I want to do it. So I will not have to do this display inline block anymore. So if I take this out, remember that by default, and I'll take out the width as well for now. So by default, remember, because these divs of class item are divs, they're going to be 100% of the width of their container by default because they're display block by default. When I set display flex, what you do is you set it on the container and then you can control the items inside. So the div of class container is where I can just type df and it will auto-complete display flex for me, which is really nice. So when I do display flex on the container, then these three guys become flex items, we call them. So when I do display flex, the items now become in a row again. So let me give them some width actually. Let's just say 50 pixels for now. And now notice that they're all touching each other and they're in a row, which is normally what I would want. I'd want to be able to specify the spacing between them myself and not have, display block have its own styles that are coming out of nowhere. I like to be able to control everything myself. So I always use display flex to position things in a row or even to position stuff on top of each other. So why did this work? Why did these guys jump into a row with each other? And that's because when a container is given display flex, all of the items inside of the container become display inline block by default. So now these are no longer display block and they're all next to each other instead of above each other now because there's a property called flex direction. And you have the option to put the flex items in a column so that they're on top of each other or a row so that they're next to each other. And by default, the flex direction is row, which is why without even specifying it, they've become next to each other. These items can be given, the width in percentage. So I could now kind of get them to be about a third. Let's say I wanted each of the items to be vertically centered as well. I have a property called align items center. And what align items center does is it moves all the items to the middle vertically. There's other options. There's flex start, which would be back to what we had initially, and flex end, so it will go to the bottom. We also can control what happens on the x-axis. So let's say that the width of each of these items was only 50 pixels. Then, again, responsively, this is not very good, right? They stay there. Unless if we wanted that to be the case, then those items stay there. What if we want them to be spaced out? Then we have justify content. We have different options like center, where each of the items are still next to each other, but they're in the middle, or we have something like space between, which spreads them out. Now, this is a more responsive CSS property because as I drag this guy here and increase the size of the screen, the relationship between these items remains the same. which means this guy will always be on the right, this guy will always be on the left, this guy will always be in the middle, no matter how big or small the screen is. So this is what you would consider like a responsive property. All right, so that's generally how Flex will work for you as far as responsiveness goes. I'll also talk a little bit about the idea of cards and grids and stuff now. So what we've done so far is just have a simple box as our container and then three little guys as items. But if you were to extract that idea into this UI, we could actually call this space here with all of the properties in Airbnb in it. This guy here stretches all the way down to like here. So we can call that our container. And actually, each of these guys can be an item, where each item can also contain things as well. And there's something called CSS grid, where instead of setting on the container display flex, you say display grid. And then there's some grid related properties instead of justify content, align item center, things like that, that will help you define how the grid should behave. You can also achieve a grid-like system with Flex as well, but grid is a little bit better because there are some limitations with the Flex approach actually. And I'll actually show you that when I do video 2 of this series. So anyway, I'm not going to get into making a grid necessarily. I'll just show you a little bit about what you can do with Flex, just to give you the idea. So let's say that each of these items is like an Airbnb option, right? With housing, with an image and a title and all this stuff. If I wanted them in a grid system, what I can do is say Flex wrap and then wrap. And so now, because all three, let's say I specify the width as being a lot, like 100 pixels, and our container is, at the moment, half of 272. So it's like 130 pixels right now, the green guy. So it couldn't possibly fit three of our items because each are width 100. So flex wrap, actually let me make the container just to show you a width of 250 pixels. So it can fit two, but not three, right? Because each item is 100 pixels, so it can fit two, but the third one wraps down here. So that's kind of how you would make a grid with Flex. But as I said, there are limitations and you should use grid instead. And I'll show you more about grid in the next video, but just showing you that the grid idea and Flex both allow you to achieve something like this, where no matter the size of your screen, like the grid looks good. Okay, so now let's talk about max width. So the common scenario where you would use that, there's other scenarios, of course, but one of the most common ones, as I showed you, is this input bar, where after it reaches a certain width, it stops growing. So how would we achieve something like that? Well, let me just make another div here. Let's call it input bar. It's just a div, it's not actually an input, but it doesn't really matter right now. I'm just going to style it as if it was. Make it look like an input bar by giving it a height of 50 pixels and a width of, let's say, 500, now let's say 200 pixels, and border solid blue, let's say. So there's my guy. I'm going to give it some margin bottom so it's not touching the other guys. So we're looking at it separately here. So again, because I've defined it in pixels, it's not going to change size at all. But let's say I give it a max width instead of a width of 500 pixels. Well, now it's going to stretch to be 500 pixels. Now, as the screen size gets below 500 pixels, the width actually fits the screen. But when I grow, then get to above 500 pixels, it stops growing. So that's kind of how you set a max width and how that works. And then we get to media queries. So let's say that, let me change this container again to be related to the screen. So instead of width 250 pixels, I'm going to make it 50% again. And I'm going to remove a bunch of these flex items of these divs of class item. So here we are back to this again. So let's say I want the green box to kind of change how it relates to the size of the screen at a certain point. So right now, no matter what size the screen is, the green box is going to be 50% of the width of the screen. What if at, say, 500 pixels, Actually, what's more common is you go by device size. So I search media query sizes, and some common media query breakpoints are 320 for most smartphones in portrait mode, 480 for larger smartphones in portrait mode, and smaller tablets in portrait mode, 768 pixels. There are some general ideas of the pixel amounts for different breakpoints. So let's say I'm switching from a phone to a tablet view now, and I want to deal with 768 pixels and up. I'm going to create a breakpoint by doing this at media screen, and you can either do min width or max width. So basically, min width means 768 pixels and up. Max width means 768 pixels and below. So min width would mean, okay, all these styles above here are for screens that are smaller than 768 pixels, but once we get to 768 pixels, whatever we define inside these curly braces will override anything up here whenever there's a clash. Anytime that the stuff we've defined up here and the stuff we define in here don't clash, then the stuff up here remains true. But let's say I'm defining stuff for the input bar here, and I define its height, and then I go input bar here and I change its height to 100 pixels instead of 50 up there. Now, all that's going to change for the input bar is its height, meaning everything else related to the input bar won't change. So the input bar is here. Let's say I get to 768, and you see, once I get there, that the size of the height doubles because it goes from 50 to 100 pixels. So right now, as well, for our container, at the moment, it is 50% of the width of the screen, but let's say that at 768 pixels and up, I want its width to be 100% of the screen. Then once we get to 768 pixels, now for the rest of the sizes of screens up from 768, the container is 100% of the size of the screen. So that is how you deal with media queries, basically. And just to show you media queries in relation to a real website, here we have Airbnb, and notice that at 768 or 744, the UI changes a lot. So that's a breakpoint in their UI. Okay, so responsive image, I'm not going to really mention that. Typically, if the image is defined size-wise with like the previous stuff we talked about, either a percentage of a container, a percentage of the screen size, or defined size-wise with flex in relation to other elements, then it's going to scale in size just like any element would, with the screen size changing or an element size changing in relation to the screen and everything. The only thing you may have to do, I don't remember when or when not you'll exactly have to do it, but let's say you had an image, then one property you might want to consider is aspect ratio. So basically, whatever aspect ratio the image is supposed to have, it's going to maintain no matter how big or small its possible size gets. So in other words, let's say that the image is in a row and it's like supposed to be 33% of the row. So it's always going to be a third of the size of the row. And then you drag the screen and then the row increases in size. The image will maintain its 33% width of the whole screen or of the row. And the height will also increase because the width increased, because if aspect ratio is going to maintain the same proportion of width size to height size. Hopefully that made sense. So you may have to specify that. And finally, I won't do too much with JavaScript, but there's ways that you can achieve responsive design in CSS, and you can also do the same in JavaScript. So with JavaScript, you can do the same thing that breakpoints do, where in JavaScript, you can recognize the size of the screen and do things accordingly. So often, if the screen is completely changing, it's a good sign that JavaScript is involved. So the difference of this in the header, let's say, to this, where notice that we're going to have a logo, some stuff up here. We're going to have a new menu as well on top of this line. Uh, in regards to these options here, there's going to be a couple things next to it now. So look how much changed. Like that's a good sign that JavaScript's involved. So it's possible to do it with CSS, but you may be duplicating a lot of the same HTML in multiple places in your HTML file, and it can be a little ugly doing it that way. And you will see exactly what I mean in the next video when I show you how I'm going to make Airbnb just like this using the CSS approach. And maybe I'll follow that video up with how I would use JavaScript to achieve the same thing and make maybe the HTML file a little bit cleaner and easier to read. So hopefully you found this video useful. I just wanted to give a general summary without making the video too long, and then we'll get into some coding and a real example in the next one. But hopefully it's helpful to you to see all these properties and different ideas laid out in a more simple way. And hopefully a lot of things clicked. And with the demonstration in the next video, it will really click how you make your website more responsive. And just to show you a little precursor to the next video, I'll show you what I'm going to start with. Of course, this is the end goal basically, to make it look like this and responsive. So as you drag it, the UI changes as such. At the moment, check out what I have. This is my UI that I'm starting with, and notice that as I drag it, nothing's moving, right? This is very common for a beginner's project, that like some things are moving, some aren't, but it doesn't look good, right? So I keep dragging the screen out and check it out. Nothing has repositioned. There's no grid system happening here with these guys. Um, Even if you look at Airbnb down here, uh, these guys are going to go on top of each other at a certain width. See, these guys are on top of each other. And then when you stretch it out, they go into the same chunk, if you will. And here, that's not happening. So we would have to deal with responsiveness to make that happen. And also down here, this guy looks different as you shrink the screen. See? And this doesn't change at all when we change the size of the screen. The images stay exactly the same size, but if you look here, the images are not only changing their grid structure, but are also shrinking and growing so that there's never a lot of space on the sides or in between them. It always looks good. And of course, the header I just showed you is not happening in regards to there being an entirely different input bar and menu options and filters and things over here, right? So all that I'm going to do in the next video, I think. Maybe I'll squeeze it all in, maybe I'll break it up into 2 videos, and then maybe I'll even do another video on how to bring JavaScript into the equation, because eventually your UI will have to deal with JavaScript. But in general, when you're talking about JavaScript, you're often talking about new things popping up on screen, such as this, and then making sure that that's responsive too. Will mostly deal with HTML and CSS properties. But with JavaScript, you're just adding new items onto the screen. So you have to, with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, consider that those are all fitting onto the screen properly as well, regardless of the screen size. So we'll get into all that in the coming videos. But again, hopefully this was helpful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if you just want to say thank you. And in the comments, drop any suggestions that you may have for future videos. I love getting suggestions, so I know exactly what is confusing you and what you want me to make. And yeah, don't forget to subscribe for the videos that are coming next and for future videos, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.